I didn't used to like history at all. I was absolutely bored by history. But when I came out here into Manitoba, I really became interested in history because people had questions and I would say, well, I'll go look it up. I'll go to the archives, and I'm from Ottawa, and I'll look it up. So I would look it up, and it was so interesting, and it was a history that I had never known existed before. And Canadians don't know it, and First Nation people, generally speaking, don't know it. Little bits and pieces here and there, but there's a rich, beautiful history that's here that is absolutely nothing like anyone knows from school or what they have. So I'll begin with that, and your interest is in Sandy Bay and the White Mud people, as they used to be known, Anishinaabe people before that. And they are participants in Treaty Number 1, which is probably the dividing point. If you can take the whole history and say before Treaty 1 and after Treaty 1. So it's a watershed moment in history. People were there, at least in recorded history, around 1790. And probably there before that. But the first written evidence that I can find that they were there are some of the birth certificates that were issued later. Someone would say, well, where were you born? I was born on Prairie Portage. And well, how many years ago? 25 years ago. And people would calculate, and that would end up in 1790s. And of course, the parents were obviously there before the baby was born. So we know it goes way back. The people tended to be a mixture that goes way back between the indigenous people, not only of Manitoba, but also going back to Sault Ste. Marie and going back to Manitoulin Island and into that Fort Michilimackinac, which is where today called Mackinac Island, is at the peak of the globe of Michigan, at the point where the Lake Huron and Lake Michigan sort of join at that point. So this is the area that the indigenous part comes from, and because that was the French trading route of French Canadians, as they went into Manitoba and into Western Canada, Northern Canada, they would end up in places and they get married and they've had kids and they stayed there and their kids grew up there and so on. And that was the mixture of the two. Now some people would say, oh, they're Métis. And I say, no, 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 no. These people always maintained their Indianness, if I can use that term. They always identified themselves as Indians. And at the time of treaty, in particular, in 1871, they all had a choice, because the rule was, if you have one drop of white blood and one drop of Indian blood, you can take your pick. And so you'd have one brother who would become Indian under treaty, another brother would become half-breed, Métis, whatever they called them at the time. So this distinguishes the people who today are at Sandy Bay from being Métis people. They had the opportunity and they chose not to be. They reaffirmed their identity as Indigenous people, First Nation people. So that is the community that is there, and this is also an interesting community in that it was, because of the French influence, was largely Catholic. There were three groups of people. There were Catholics, there were Scotch, and there were English. The intermarriages took place with those three people, and the children, the Scotch children, grew up to speak Gaelic. The English half-breeds, as they proudly called themselves, were Anglicans and spoke English, and the French spoke French and were Catholics. And so people were divided by language and culture, religion, but not necessarily by blood, if you would call it that, because the predominant bloodline was Anishinaabe. So these were the people who settled in at the place that today is called Portage-la Prairie. But they did not settle, the Portage-la Prairie is aptly named because there is a portage that runs from the southern base of Lake Manitoba and connects it with the Assiniboine River. That portage is a key transportation link, because if you go downstream, which is north at that point, you're into Lake Manitoba, which you can then cross over into Cedar Lake and into the lower Saskatchewan River, and from there on go all the way to Edmonton, or you can go north to Yellowknife, into the Athabasca. You can just travel all over Western Canada from that point. Or you can go south at that point, and you can go into the Assiniboine River, which flows into today's Winnipeg. And from that point, you could go into up to the mouth of the Winnipeg River, and go from there into the Great Lakes, and travel the Great Lakes system, and go into Montreal and into the Atlantic Ocean. So that was that access. Or there was a third one, and that is at the Forks in Winnipeg, people could continue to go upstream on the Red River and get into Wisconsin and into Minnesota and into the whole Mississippi River, which takes you to Louisiana, or into the Missouri River. So it was like the center of the universe there. Where people could go in all directions. And the people who today are the Sandy Bay people are people who, yes, they were hunters, they were fishers, they were trappers, they knew all of that stuff, but they also were into an industry which was the transportation industry, because they had a monopoly on the portage. The portage is about, I guess, 30 kilometers or so long. And they had a base at the Assiniboine River, and people would get off at the Assiniboine, and they'd want to get into Lake Manitoba because they were headed west or north. And so they needed help. They needed people to carry their canoes and their goods and their supplies and everything for the long trip ahead. And so here are the people, the white mud people, that are there ready to give them a hand. And of course the opposite was true. There would be people arrive at the southern point of Lake Manitoba, and they would say, I've got all these furs and all these things that, you know, I want to get back to Montreal and into England and wherever, and I need someone to help me. And so this was what the people had really, during the navigation system, which of course is the before freeze up, and throughout until it freezes again, was their main occupation. And then during the winter there was fishing and hunting and trapping. And this was the way the people survived there. And they were there, and they were a settled community. You know, I know people have to travel to hunt, and the buffalo hunt and all of this, but these people were pretty well fixed at that place. It was a very rich community. People were, you know, of all generations, were not only smart, but they were well read. They were self-educated in many respects, but they knew what was going on in the world. these people, and because they were assisting travelers, of course, all the time, they'd pick up all the news of the travel, and then they'd discuss it with the people going south, and then they'd discuss that with the people going north, and so on. So they were right in the middle of everything going on in the world. And this was what distinguished them as a people. And with the fur trade increasingly coming in to compete with the Hudson Bay Company, which were English people, and the English employed mostly Scotch people from the Orkney Islands to work for them in the trading posts. The owners were English, but the workmen were Scotchmen. And the people who did the real work were the indigenous people who worked in the fur trade industry. So you have this mix of people in this area, and coming in from Sault Ste. Marie, which is the word Sault, S-A-U-L-T, meaning the falls in the St. Mary's River, which separates today Michigan from Ontario. There's a Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. This would be the jumping off point from the river system, the Ottawa River, and across into Lake Huron and across the North Shore, and then they get ready for the big trip across Lake Superior. And there would be Anishinaabe people at Sault Ste. Marie who had that transportation industry. They knew that route and how to go and where to go and how to travel on Lake Superior and how to handle everything and how much food to take and all of that stuff. And those people were known as Saulteaux, meaning people of the Sioux or people of the falls of the St. Lawrence River. But the word Saulteaux became so well known that people would say, "Oh, do you speak Saulteaux?" Well, they really mean, do I speak Anishinaabe? You know, it is not that it's a distinct group of people. These simply were distinct by means of location. The Hudson Bay Company, before the year 1775, was located entirely at York Factory. They did not, they had maybe a few little explorers, a few teenage kids, the Hearns and so on, that wanted to have a trip in for a year. But everyone took their furs up to York Factory. No other place to go. The English Hudson Bay Company did not come down. And then what happened was that these French traders were coming in from Montreal, and they were cutting off people on their way to Hudson Bay. "Hey, where are you going?" "I'm going to Hudson Bay. We're going to sell our furs there." "Why go all there? I'll buy them from you." And they would cut off, they would buy the furs, and the people would save months of travel by selling them in that way. And the Hudson Bay Company began to realize they were in deep trouble. As a result of that, they decided to establish their first inland trading post. And they did that at a place still called today Cumberland House, which is at the north of Lake Manitoba and at the border between Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Near the Pas. It's over to the northwest of the Pas. And so they established their first trading post at that place. And of course that meant there would be increased trade of the fur traders who would come down to man that trading post. And it was not long before they brought with them disease, brought with them smallpox. Horrible, horrible death of smallpox. And so what had happened was that in the year 1790, there had been a tremendous smallpox epidemic of the Cree people in particular. Now the Cree people had been pushed into what today, into this area of Manitoba, into Winnipeg and so on, had been pushed into that by settlement coming in from the east, moving west, settlement. They were pushed down from the north, and they were taking over Dakota territory, and in that way, in struggle fighting with the Dakotas over land and survival. So the smallpox hit this Cree population that was in southern Manitoba and killed perhaps 90% of the people, 85, 90%. You know, you think of a classroom of 30 kids, there's 3 survivors. You think of a community of 100 kids, there's 10 survivors. You know, just, think about how the people had to regroup, replan, get, so that the survivors of that could survive the winter and everything else that was taking place. But they were totally, of course, disheartened, depressed. And in was coming this fresh group of people, this Anishinaabe group from Sault Ste. Marie, accompanying the fur traders. And the Cree said to the Anishinaabe, "We are sick at heart over stepping on the bones of our relatives, of our people. And we are willing to give this, whatever is ours here, it's all yours. You can have the land, you can have everything, and you can have our war with the Dakotas." This is what they said. It's what's recorded in history. And so the Anishinaabe people then decided, they kind of liked the area, and it was empty, and there was, good trapping and so on, and they stayed. And they established themselves in this general area. And it was in this decade and the following decade that the group that today is called Sandy Bay established themselves at their position at the southern part of Lake Manitoba at a place they called Totogan. And Totogan was an established community. It wasn't a collection of teepees or, tents or whatever. People built houses there. They had the income to do it. And they knew how to get the supplies in because they carried them in, like was what they did for a living. And so they brought it in, and they built a fairly nice community in that area. And of course they also farmed, and eventually they had a few cattle, and they had some horses and some sheep and so on and so on. But what I'm getting at is they were really a well-established community in that area. At Totogan, you've got these people, and John A. MacDonald in, 1874 or something like that, says, "I'm going to build a transcontinental highway that's going to link eastern Canada with British Columbia." And that great transcontinental railway is going to go across the southern point of Lake Manitoba. He might as well have said Totogan, because that's where Totogan is right at that southern point of Lake Manitoba. Well, all of the people from Hamilton and from Ottawa and Montreal and all over eastern Canada, all the money people, the bankers and the land speculators and so on, came rushing out to Manitoba because they wanted to pick up the land that was in that area, because that land was going to be worth a lot of money, because that's where the railroad was going to be. Okay, so they came out there. And people came out there, and of course the first people they encountered were the people from Sandy Bay, who are not at Sandy Bay. They're still at Totogan. And they say, "Hey, how would you like to, we want to have a farm over here. And here's some good money for it, and so on." "Well, I don't know, but if you want to, you know how people do." So anyhow, you end up with all of these settlers starting to move into this territory next door to the people that have been living there for quite a few decades before that time. So the surveyors come down and they say to the people of Totogan, okay, where do you want your reserve? Treaty says you have first choice. They say, well, we wanted it right here where we've always been, but it's all taken up by settlers now. Uh-oh, what are we going to do? So this was a problem, that the land had already had all these settlers moving in on it. And the people of Totogan had been, within a few years after treaty, had not yet had their reserve set aside, which today would be that land along the southern shore. What happened was that they said, well, up north of us here, higher up along the shore, we have set aside a reserve for the Dakotas. It's called Township 18. And what happened was that at that time there had been some very unfortunate problems taking place in Minnesota, because the settlers had not honored the treaty. They had taken over the lands that had been set aside for the Dakota. The Dakotas were starving to death. Starving. When the first white people who set their eyes on the Forks first saw that, they wrote down in their diaries, there are 900 Yankton teepees here at the Forks. Okay. So this was their territory, and then I mentioned the war, struggle that had taken place with the Cree, and so on. And then in 1860, there had been a treaty signed between the Anishinaabe and the Dakotas. You see, it's not that white people invented treaty making. In fact, probably the indigenous people of America were much more experienced treaty makers than they were. And people from this side of the border, the Canadian side, had already participated. Their names are on the treaties in Minnesota, on the treaties in Wisconsin. They were a part of that because there was no international border that they honored at the time, and they went back and forth. So they were very experienced treaty makers. And in 1860, the Dakotas came in coming up along the Red River, all of them on horseback, all of them all dressed up, and all of them carrying a green bough, an evergreen bough, of spruce, of pine, of some evergreen tree, symbol of peace. And they came and they did a treaty with the Anishinaabe people. And the agreement was that south of the international border would be exclusively Dakota country, and Anishinaabe people would not go down there. They also agreed that there would be a line drawn along the southern shore of Lake Manitoba, east and west, and north of that line there would be no Dakotas would ever go there or ever hunt there. And the area between those two lines, between the U.S. border and a point which is now near Westbourne, Manitoba, that area would be common hunting ground, and both of us can hunt here. This will be shared territory. And this was the agreement that they entered into. And again, there were journalists present who recorded all of this. And it's all in writing. Every bit of it, every pipe that was passed, everything that was done, and it's all recorded history. How come people in Manitoba don't know this, you know? How come Dakotas don't know it? How come Manitobans don't know it? How come Anishinaabe don't? You know, it's beautiful, beautiful history. It took place. When the Dakotas around Portage in 1874 were being told, hey, we've got a reserve for you. It's north of here, along the shore of Lake Manitoba. It's all been surveyed for you, a whole township. Go on up there and you'll have your township, 6 miles long, 6 miles high. The Dakotas go up there. They start up there. and they get to a place near Westbourne where the line is, we don't go any further. We don't go. And they turned around and came back to Portage. Okay? That's why there was this vacant land that was up there that had not been settled, that had been, was already an Indian reserve. And so this is what they told the people at Totogan. If you've got to move out of here, why don't you go up? It's Township 18, it's all laid out, it's all ready to go, and it's all yours, whole township. So they did. There were already a few people who had some cattle running up there and so on, and so it wasn't a strange area. And they decided that they would go up there and that they would settle in there, and they rebuilt their houses and rebuilt their barns and they plowed their fields and did all of that. They relocated into that area. And that's how the people of Totogan came to be at the people of Sandy Bay. That's how it happened. Now this is very interesting because the fact that they had property at Totogan has never been dealt with. This is an outstanding claim to this day. They were forced out of that area because the Crown did not honor its promise that you will have first choice for the lands that you want, for your farms. This is what they were supposed to have. So anyhow, they go up there and they settle on Township 18, and they get going again. They were told when they went up there, according to the written record, they were told that this entire township is yours. Now, because it's located on the lake, there's questions along that marshland that is along there, yeah, as to whether that's a part of it. And as it so happens that that border has shifted over the years, and there is another claim that is there, because the border is not the highway. And so people need to pay attention to that border. It can be easily surveyed still today and know where is the boundary of Township 18, because it has another township on this side to the north and the south. You know, there. Yeah. In other words, it hits something that also has to be measured. You need to have the surveyor come because it's all written down. The surveyor's notes, what he saw through that telescope, and it's all in writing, and you can recreate that. This is the government's job. This is an Indian reserve, and there is land missing from that reserve, yeah, and you want it resurveyed. This is the problem, because I started talking about genocide and how, you know, it's not just physical. It's that settlement is not an event. You don't say Manitoba was settled in 1871. Settling is a process, and the process of settling goes on and on to this very day. The three groups of people, the English half-breeds, the French half-breeds, the Métis, and the Scotch half-breeds, who needed to be settled somewhere, because if they didn't, they were going to be running into settlers. In other words, where were they going to go? They were also kind of displaced. So they gave out scrip, that was called, which was good for a certain amount of land. Depends, some of it was 160 acres, some 220 acres, some 240 acres. You got this piece of paper that said that you were living here in Manitoba, you were living in the Northwest Territories in 1870, which is the year that the Crown kind of said, okay, this is now a part of Canada, pending on the treaties. If you had no treaties, it never would be a part of Canada today. That was a condition of it becoming a part, that there be a treaty. Otherwise, Queen Victoria says, I got no right to give you anything. I don't own that land. Okay. So they had this thing called scrip. people had a choice. They could either take that script to some vacant land and say, this is mine, I'm going to settle here, here's my piece of paper. Or they could take that to a bank and say, I'm going to sell my script, give me $240, quite a bit of money at the time, and they took their 240 bucks. And that was good not only for the head of the family and his adult wife, it was also for each child. Even if that child had died before the script was issued, providing that child lived in that area after 1870. So some people could go to the bank and get like 1,800 bucks. A lot of money, a lot of money. And some people used it, did well, became prosperous. Other people did other things with the money, ended up being poor and with nothing, and that's the story, that what happened. So there were people who decided that they would make a living out of doing this, and they became known as script speculators. And they would be people who would go to someone and say, you get your script yet? No, I'm thinking of going up there next summer and I'll get it then. Well, why wait, they would say. You know, 240 bucks, I'll tell you what I do. I'll give you $120 right now, right today. All you got to do is sign it away, but cash now. Do I wait? Do I take it? Okay, where do I sign? And a lot of people sold their script, and the script speculators waited a year, went to the bank, said, here's a script, here's the permission, give me the $240. That's what happened by the thousands of people. So the same group of script speculators, and there is some suspicion that they were in cahoots with the Indian agent of the time, a man by the name of Hector Martineau. They went to the people of Sandy Bay and they said, hey, how would you people like to make some money? You're entitled to this because all of you people have at least one drop of white blood and one drop of Indian blood, that if you want the script, you can have it. People said, oh, where do we sign? And they said, well, this is the way you do it, and do you want to wait and go to the bank next year, or would you like your money now? So many of the people took the money, and they took their script. Now, what happened? They thought, well, at least we've got 120 more bucks than we did have for the whole family, 600 bucks, I'm pretty good. What they didn't tell the people was, you got to get off your reserve. If you are Métis or half-breed, you're not an Indian anymore. And you're on an Indian reserve. Get off the reserve. So I think at that time there were in the neighborhood of 200 and some people that lived at Sandy Bay, that lived in Township 18. And of that number, I think all but 6 of them took script. And it was several years later that people came around and said, what are you people still doing here? You took script. Out of here. You're on an Indian reserve. You're not Indians anymore. Oh, like, what are they going to do? You know, people, we didn't know that. We weren't told that. We were defrauded. What are we going to do about it? And there were eventually enough of them that about 1886, 87 in that area there, that they were becoming poverty-stricken. They couldn't farm anymore. They couldn't do anything anymore, and it was going to be a problem, like a social problem in the area. And the government said, "Okay, we'll make you a deal. You want to be Indians again? You can be. But you got to pay that money back, all $240 for each and every one of you. People say, how are we going to do that? We got no money. You've got $5 a year that comes in at treaty time, and we'll take it off until it's paid back. From you, from your children, from your grandchildren, from your great-grandchildren, we'll collect every penny of it back until every penny has been paid. This is what they did. And they did collect it back. And people went without that $5 a year for year after year after year, and children who were not even born at the time are having their treaty money taken back. I'm not sure this is a story that's well known at Sandy Bay, but it's a very poignant story. It's raises some very profound questions, and it's a very disturbing, to me at least, it's a very disturbing story. The whole thing is disturbing. But most of the people came back. There were a few people who, by the time this all got worked out, had already located up near the Ochre River, Turtle River, north of St. Rose du Lac. And they're still there in that area. The Laquettes and many of the other people that moved out simply found it to their advantage economically to just stay up there. And there were enough of them up there that they still maintained their community, but they were no longer legally Indians to this day. So this was, was a very important part of Sandy Bay's history. And the history after that time is relatively routine. It just kind of unfolded over a period of time, and the history afterwards is a common history with First Nations all across Canada. The Indian Act impositions, the white paper, all of that, the Royal Commission, OCA, everything. It became a more general history that rather than the very individual history that took place at Sandy Bay and only at Sandy Bay. We were here first. And if you think I gave anything up, show me. Show me where my parents agreed that I was no longer Anishinaabe, that I did not have the right to do this or to do that. You show me. Because you can't do it. That's why I can say that with such confidence. It's not there. What you do is you tell me that I'm no good and I'm too lazy to work and get off welfare and to do these other things, so that I'm ashamed of myself and of my past, and I don't want to learn anything more about it. See? And that's why this is so important, that people know their history, because everybody wants to be somebody, and somebody they can be proud of. Many of the people who are elders are still born 100 years after treaty. And in other words, people don't always have their history. They've been denied their history over the years. And they may know a little bit, they may know about something else. But I'll bet you can take what I told you today and show it to a group of elders, and most of them will say, I didn't know that. Mm-hmm. No one ever told me that. Why didn't I know that?